Hello again. We're going to go ahead and split Chapter 11 into two parts since it's a rather involved chapter once again. So the first half of this presentation in this chapter is going to focus upon the earliest stage of human life, of course, which is conception and fetal development, and we'll move on to the neonatal and infancy period in the second part today. Childbearing is an interesting factor, I suppose, in our society today. You know, there's so much controversy around so many different aspects of the conception process and even human parental interaction before conception and what happens after a child is conceived and when is the child considered to be a human being and how should the child be raised after that, and on and on and on. So there are many social and cultural factors that come into play in child rearing, and the text kind of touches on some of these, and also first of all, it starts out by talking about the fact that without childbearing, without procreation, cultures would cease to exist, and so we have to find a way to bear children and raise them successfully in order for our species to continue. That's pretty obvious. But there are social meanings that are associated or attached to child rearing that has a lot to do with how we approach it. In one culture to another is very different, and also across time it's very different. But some of the factors that are involved in this issue today involve things like, for instance, how we control reproduction, or if we control reproductions. There are so many options available for that now and accessible to most people, let's say, in the United States society, but not necessarily to those individuals in economically disadvantaged communities, and certainly not available in some of the most impoverished nations in the world. There are new ethical issues being raised when we look at the advances that science and medicine is making. For instance, the discussion about cloning is one one example of that. Childbirth is more frequently delayed in our culture now in the United States than it had been, and at the same time, more people are seeking fertility treatment, and at the same time, also deciding to remain childless or child-free voluntarily. So again, there's a whole range of attitudes about childbearing and child rearing. Our marriage rate has declined in the United States, perhaps associated with the fact that cohabitation has become more acceptable socially than it might have been 40 or 50 years ago. And perhaps as a result of this, more children are born to unmarried mothers than previously. At the same time, though, our birth rate has declined because of a lot of the capacities we have now for controlling reproduction. So we have smaller families, and this also has implications that we'll touch on later in this chapter. Teen pregnancy has declined over the last decade, which is a major step forward for our culture. Family values and sexual mores there's a lot of demonstration and different variations in beliefs and attitudes about those things as well. In families themselves, mothers and fathers are feeling less restricted to traditional gender role stereotyping, both in terms of running the home and in raising the children. It's more common now to have gay and lesbian couples and individuals becoming parents, and also more mothers, single mothers or married mothers, are in the paid labor force. So this really changes the face of the family unit and child rearing processes than, say, 50 or 60 years ago. There also have been a lot of changes in terms of childbirth education, and one of the things that has happened in more recent years is that childbirth education has sort of become an institution in society now with pregnant women, whereas it was not before. And now it has moved into a hospital setting, and rather than being a kind of a voluntary thing that goes on. And so more and more pregnant couples, pregnant mothers in particular, but oftentimes mothers and fathers are attending classes in preparation for childbirth. And as a result of that, there's an overload of information now. Parents have to pick and choose between who they want to believe and what technique and approach they feel is best. There's also a lot of health promotion activities for pregnant women as it's become more obvious that maternal health is, well, I don't know if it's more obvious now, but it's certainly become more pressing now for pregnant women to maintain their own health and to be careful about what they take into their system and what they do with their bodies during pregnancy, because it has become obvious that it impacts the fetus and the developing child. As mentioned earlier, more pregnant women are working and also working longer, and there are more unmarried pregnant women. And so all of these kinds of factors go into the type of education programs that are being offered. Now, the most frequent place of childbirth, I believe, in the United States continues by far to be in a hospital setting. In the olden days, and I have to say this is before I was born even, that most children were born at home. And for a variety of reasons, as medical science began to advance and it began to be seen as much more safe and sanitary for the child to be born in a hospital, and so it moved into a hospital setting. Childbirth did. But other kinds of facilities have developed to kind of take away some of the sterile nature, let's say, of the hospital delivery room, and for that matter, hospital delivery rooms have also been made to be more homey in appearance, so that the whole childbirth experience is something that is kind of a warmer and easier process perhaps for people. But freestanding birth centers oftentimes are located near hospitals. There are home-like birthing rooms now within hospital labor departments, those kinds of things. There has been some movement in terms of the payment for birthing centers and things, so that the ACA has mandated that. Now, it's anybody's guess what's going to happen with the ACA and those various mandates as time goes on, but at the present time, at least, a payment is approved for birthing centers. And women who give birth in centers, and I would say hospital settings as well, have reduced there's the likelihood of any kind of medical intervention being necessary during childbirth. Has increased the likelihood of spontaneous vaginal birth and also increased satisfaction. Aside from doctors and gynecologists or pediatricians that are delivering babies, obstetricians, who are delivering babies now, there are also nurse midwives who are trained birthing specialists who are very involved in births, and it says here that 1 in 8 vaginal deliveries sees the services of a nurse midwife. There's also a person called a birth doula, who has become part of the childbirth experience for more and more women these days. These are lay women who are employed to stay with the woman through the entire labor and provide all sorts of different kinds of support and deal with all the non-medical aspects of the labor and delivery. And my understanding is that the birth doulas also make provision for the presence of the father in the delivery room as well. And that's another change that has happened in terms of delivery. His fathers were excluded from the delivery room for years and years and years. They sat outside, but now at least more frequently fathers can be in the delivery room and support the mother of the child during the birthing process. Now, there's a concept mentioned in the text called the developmental niche of child rearing, and it says basically that when a baby is born, they enter into a developmental niche in which the culture and all its attitudes and all its resources really guides every aspect of the developmental process. And the text identifies 3 different components of that developmental niche, which includes physical and social settings of everyday life, the child rearing customs and beliefs, and also the psychology of the caretaker, generally the parent. and the parents' ideas really are the dominant force in how the infant and toddler develop. That's certainly not surprising. So an example of this that I mentioned here is that children in the United States now are born into smaller families, and so given that, then the children get more attention from their parents and probably have more resources available to them than might have been the case with larger families in prior years. At the same time, individuals that are born in impoverished neighborhoods in the United States or elsewhere enter into a developmental niche that's characterized sometimes with infection and malnutrition. And so you can kind of see a lot is determined by just where the child is born and what the culture is around child rearing. Now here's an example, and this is in the text, of different factors involved in the physical and social settings of daily life as far as child rearing is concerned. So this includes things like, whether the toys are present or not, what is the nutritional status of children in the culture, or is this a nuclear family, an extended family, siblings involved, those kinds of things. For customs of childcare and child rearing, ideas like, how do you determine feeding and eating schedules? Some cultures are more focused upon having the child sleep when the parents sleep and wake when the parents wake and feed at certain times. And in fact, in our society, it's believed that helps children to self-regulate, basically. Are there initiation rites? Is there, those kinds of things? And then also the psychology of the caretaker. What kind of styles of parenting is this caretaker going to bring to the relationship? Are they authoritarian? Or are they more laissez-faire? Those types of things. What kind of beliefs are there about parenting? And what are the values that a culture has? So all of these things are going to come into play in determining the experience of, child rearing and pregnancy and childbirth in the years after that. Very good sociological look at a medical phase of life. Contraception, it's one of those things that interestingly is, despite concerns about overpopulation in many parts of the world, it's still something that is somewhat controversial. First of all, it's not universally available to individuals, and sometimes those cultures where it's needed the worst, it just isn't easily accessible for people who are sexually active. For those where contraception is available, sometimes religions come into play to oppose its use. The Catholic Church opposes any forms of artificial contraception. The only approved contraception technique in the Catholic Church is the rhythm method, which is notoriously deficient in terms of its effectiveness. Again, I say that because being raised Catholic, I'm aware of that. I don't know of other religions, at least in the United States, that strongly oppose the use of contraceptives. And that includes condom use, interestingly, even in this day and age of AIDS and other sexually transmitted diseases. 62% of United States women, despite this, perhaps, of reproductive age, use some form of contraception, and almost all sexually active women indicate that they have used a contraceptive during their lifetime. But 222 million women in low-income countries who don't want to get pregnant have no access to contraceptives. That's a striking figure when you consider the concerns about population control in many countries around the world. I had to pull this off. It didn't really talk a lot about condom use, and I went to a website. I think it wasn't the CDC, but it looked to me a legitimate website that said that condom use in the United States right now is increasing overall among men ages 15 to 44. But the use among teens, male teenagers, is which has one of the highest rates of sexually transmitted diseases, is not increasing. It said the rate of condom use among males aged 15 to 19 is something over 50% since 2002. So That's and this these figures were from I think 2015 or 2016, pretty recent anyway. And so, and it's interesting, because I thought with the when AIDS became an issue in the 80s, when it first came to public attention, everything like that, I thought we would see an increase in condom use, and yet I'm not finding anything in at least what I found on the web, and I didn't do deep research, but I didn't find anything to suggest that's the case. And in fact, in Africa, it says that while the rate of AIDS infections go up, the the rate of use of condoms have plummeted, and perhaps there's a connection between that. But there's a belief that in Africa now, where the AIDS rate is very high, that the use of condoms isn't considered to be cool anymore, and so they're experimenting with things like producing colored condoms and flavored condoms and aromatic condoms and things like that. So just to attract people to them. I'm pausing because I was just thinking about a book that Dan Brown wrote. It was one that I read quite recently, in fact, and it's called Inferno. It was published, I think, in 2013. It's a movie now, also, and the I don't want to give away the story for those of you that might want to read it. But the point of the book is it relates to overpopulation and the fact that it seems that the best efforts of the World Health Organization and all these organizations that are trying to manage the population of the world has been useless, and this sort of has this doomsday prediction about overpopulation, and that well, again, without giving the crux of the story away, this is what it deals with. It's a very interesting kind of, although it's entirely fiction, like a lot of his stories, there's enough elements of truth that it kind of makes you wonder, and it's a little disturbing, the whole premise of the book. So just something if you're looking for some fiction reading. Inferno by Dan Brown. But in any event, back to the topic here: control over conception and pregnancy. Abortion, of course, is a topic that is hotly contested in our society, much more so here, I believe, than in most other societies around the world. Of course, those nations where, again, the Roman Catholic Church in particular is the predominant religion, abortion is often illegal altogether. But in I think most developed nations around the world, abortion is legal. And the debate about this topic, which has been raging for well, really most of my life, in fact, is something that's a source of some fascination with other cultures around the world. In 1973, the Supreme Court issued the ruling in Roe versus Wade, which legalized abortions in the first trimester, essentially saying it was a decision between a woman and her doctor. I believe it was Henry Hyde in 1976 proposed and had it passed in Congress an amendment that limited federal funding for abortions. And in 1989, the Supreme Court again ruled in another case, Webster versus Reproductive Health Services, that Medicaid could not be used to fund abortions as well. And this has since been expanded, and this is something I wasn't aware of, also to include insurance programs for federal employees and also for Indian Health Service insurance programs. So really any health insurance program the feds have their funds involved in apparently does not fund abortions any longer. The irony of this is, of course, with women on Medicaid, there's so much resentment about people, depending upon the system, and so many of the recipients of Medicaid, are connected to one public assistance program or another, and they want. Just to put this bluntly, what they want is for these women to stop having babies, but they don't want to pay for those babies. They want to help support those babies when the babies are born, but by the same token, they do not want to fund abortion. And in some cases, the courts now have ruled that private companies don't even have to fund contraceptive techniques and measures anymore, and so it's really just a gnarl here, that this whole topic of contraception and abortions and just keeps our nation riled up, and I don't see an end to that in the near future. The issue about fetal viability is one of those I guess conflict points. Is the child a child? Is that child a human being? Is the fetus a human being before the point of viability, and those kinds of things? And should abortion be permitted after viability? The viability is, of course, that point where the fetus can survive outside the womb. And there are two different types of abortions available: medical abortions, which essentially is a sort of a morning after pill that medication taken to end pregnancy, and actually it's quite effective. And the ones that get most of the attention, of course, are those surgical interventions that are done in a clinic or office. And the text goes into some of the more specific techniques that are used in the different stages of pregnancy to bring about an abortion. It's interesting that it says, looking back, that once again, almost all of the women, 90% of the women who obtained an abortion, felt it was the right thing to do. This was some years later. It was quite some time had passed by the time they did this survey. Only 2% reported it to be the wrong decision. The other side of this is couples who want to be pregnant who can't get pregnant, and so infertility interventions have become more popular in the last well, no more popular, but more available at least. But I understand that they're extremely expensive. But they are available to the couples who want to give birth to their own biological child and not involve other people. Infertility is couples considered to be infertile if they're not able to create a viable embryo after a year of intercourse without contraception. Looks pretty much split between the percentage of times when individual or infertility has to do with the female or the male, and in about a quarter of those circumstances, really both of them contribute to the problem. And as the text points out, not only is it very expensive as a process, but also just the experience of infertility and the treatment for it can cause an equal amount of emotional distress for the couple. About 1% of infants born in the United States are the result of assisted reproductive technologies, or ART interventions, and those include things like in vitro fertilization. Well, you can see the list there: gestational surrogate parents and those kinds of things. Again, in vitro fertilization. That should say in vitro, not in verto. In vitro fertilization is a something that's debated in our society. Almost half of the births resulting from one of these procedures results in a multiple birth, which is interesting. At least in 2009 it did, and I assume it's still the case. And of course, another option for those individuals who can't conceive children in one fashion or another who is adoption, and this still can be just as emotionally troubling and difficult as any infertility treatments are as well. So this is from the text. I added the color just to make it a little bit easier to comprehend when you look at it on the screen, but different types of infertility, male and female, and the interventions that are available for those types of infertility. So generally speaking, a human infant goes through a period of gestation that lasts 40 weeks. And during this time, the fertilized ovum, the fertilized egg, becomes a fully developed infant. So you can kind of estimate the expected date of birth based upon either the time of the mother's last menstrual period, or I believe when it was believed that the fertilization occurred, which I think is generally considered to be 2 weeks after that period. And so this is where the gestational age and days from the time of fertilization can differ. But in any event, generally speaking, 266 to 280 days. And it's organized into trimesters of 3 months each. And these trimesters are, you hear about them a lot in the debate about abortion and so on. But the intercourse results in a release of an average of 200 to 300 million sperm in a healthy, typical male. But the lifespan is relatively short. And only 1 or 2 in 1,000 of the original sperm actually reach the fallopian tubes. One sperm is all it takes to penetrate the egg and this actually then triggers a biochemical response which keeps the other sperm from entering. And the fertilized egg is referred to as a zygote, and will then begin to divide. And it says a 7-day journey to the uterus. Once the zygote is implanted in the uterine wall, then it matures and it becomes known as an embryo. So by the 3rd week, this embryo, the tissue in the embryo, begins differentiating into organs. And of course, during this period of time, the embryo is very vulnerable to teratogens, the substances that can harm the developing organism. We'll be touching on some of them in a few moments. The placenta, which is a filter, really, that between the mother and the growing embryo, also forms during this period of time. And the umbilical cord connects the fetus to the placenta. These are all things I'm sure we all know. I'm not really sure why I even put the slide up, but it was there. So, and the amniotic fluid protects the embryo throughout the pregnancy. Now, here's an interesting thing, and I have gone through this list and I've looked at it time and time. This is a list of teratogens and the negative effects those teratogens can have on fetal development. And I've gone through this and over because sometimes I can look right at something and miss it, but totally absent from this list is alcohol. And I don't, I'm looking through the list saying, okay, are there like any of these substances listed here really the chemical part of alcohol? That I can't even see that, and so I'm not sure. I looked in the index of the book. It does not mention alcohol during pregnancy at all as a teratogen or anything that can harm the fetus. And FASD, and certainly in some parts of the country, FASD is a much larger issue than in others. And so I have to say it really boggles my mind that alcohol and FASD isn't mentioned here in this discussion about the gestation of a human being. And so I went out and got some information. And again, I know you've been exposed to this, but this just really belongs in this discussion. It has to be here. And FASD may be certainly a bigger concern in Alaska because of the high rate of alcohol use and abuse in Alaska, but nonetheless, it's an issue for all over the nation. And I may have to write to the author to find out why this wasn't included here. But anyway, a little bit about, according to the American Pregnancy Association website, and it says below that this came from the Center for Disease Control. That reference is incorrect. But there is no known amount of alcohol that is safe to consume while pregnant, and the more you drink, the more you will increase the risk that your baby will have problems. According to the Surgeon General, the type of drinking that creates the greatest risk of FASD is binge drinking, which involves drinking more than 5 drinks at one time, or drinking 7 or more drinks in 1 week. Drinking less than this amount has also been known to lead to FASD, and this is why we regard any amount of alcohol consumption during pregnancy as being unsafe. Alcohol is a teratogen, and when a pregnant woman consumes alcohol during the pregnancy, her baby does as well, because alcohol passes freely through the placenta to the baby. Any drink containing alcohol can harm the fetus. Now, interestingly, my mother would have told you one of the first things that the doctor told her when she found out she was pregnant was, get yourself a glass of wine and sit down and, just be calm and have some wine occasionally. It was believed that helped to calm the mother's nerves and that it was a good thing for the baby. And of course, we've learned a lot of other things since. There is no known safe amount of alcohol that can be consumed by a pregnant woman. Now, the problem here is that women oftentimes are pregnant for weeks before they're aware they're pregnant, and we're talking about the early stages of embryonic development and such. And so if a woman is sexually active and is, particularly if she's binge drinking or drinking frequently, as that quotation suggests, that baby is subject to developing, having malformations or whatever developmental issues related to fetal alcohol syndrome. And so what I have heard in several trainings that I've participated in and about FASD over the years, that the experts are saying, if you are sexually active and you could get pregnant, which means that, one is sexually active without using any birth control mechanisms, anything like this, if there's a potential for you to become pregnant, you should not be drinking. Now, to some that may seem like an extreme recommendation, but it is really the only safe recommendation for a sexually active woman where there's a potential for that person to become pregnant. And there also have been some indications that drinking among males, the males who impregnate a woman, can also harm the baby as well. And so men aren't off the hook here either. We always talk about, the pregnant woman related to FASD, but if you do some research, you're going to find out the males have some things to be concerned about as well. So fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is what it's now being called. In the olden days, it was fetal alcohol syndrome and fetal alcohol effects, FAS and FAE. FAE kids were those kids that didn't have the facial features, the physical features the FAS kids had. And so they were somehow considered to be less severely impacted, but the fact is that it just means that they were impacted by maternal alcohol use at a different period of time in that woman's pregnancy. And nowadays, the experts can pretty much tell you what, a certain amount of drinking at what stage of the pregnancy, what developmental issues that infant will experience, depending upon when the mother was doing the drinking. But these effects are lifetime irreversible. And result in physical, mental, and neurobehavioral birth defects. So I feel very strongly that this is a topic that's very, very important, and I have actually raised some boys that were fetal alcohol to one degree or another on the syndrome. By the way, the FASD now is a syndrome, so that it's kind of more of a continuum and not really in terms of severity, because even the FAE kids, some of their neurological problems are every bit as severe as the FAS kids might experience, and so it's not a matter of severity so much as it's just a matter of what the symptomology is, I suppose. And so, I'm just very familiar with the impact of these things, and I've seen young men struggle with this well into their 40s, the effects of this. Up to 40,000 babies are born with FASD every year in the United States. And this does come from the CDC, according to the CDC, few estimates for the full range of FASD are available. But community studies using physical examination give us some idea, and it says that some Western European countries, as well as in the United States, number as high as 2 to 5 children born with FASD per 100 school children. So that's 2 to 5% of the population have been impacted by maternal alcohol abuse during pregnancy. The lifetime cost for one individual with FAS in 2002 was estimated to be $2 million. $2 million. And this is just an average. It doesn't include data with people with other FASD symptoms and things like this. But it's estimated the cost of the U.S. for FAS alone is over $4 billion every year. So it's, if you can't engage anybody in a discussion about alcohol and the need to, if you're talking to somebody who's really conservative, it's all budget, and doesn't want to support funding for programs that are prevention oriented, which is what we need in this particular case, start quoting these kind of statistics. When you start talking dollars and cents with those people, they listen. And that's why it's here. In Alaska, we're all familiar. I mean, the alcohol use and abuse is higher among adults, and the CDC site that I found reported a very high rate of alcohol use by women in the 18 to 44 year old group, which is kind of adult childbearing years at least, and an extremely high rate of binge drinking by women of the same age group. And remember, binge drinking is one of those high risk situations for for harming embryos. So there, I'll get off my soapbox. So during the first trimester, even though most women don't know they're pregnant during the earliest weeks, teratogens are already harming the developing organism if they're present. By the 8th week after fertilization, the embryo is mature enough to be called a fetus. And so we've gone from a sperm and an ovum to a zygote to an embryo and now a fetus. And from the 7th to 12th week, the fetal heart rate can be heard somewhere in that period of time. And usually by 12 weeks, the sex of the fetus can also be determined. Spontaneous abortions, or we call them miscarriages, pregnancy lost to prior 20 weeks of gestation, which, well, that's a little bit out. It goes beyond the first trimester, but it is most prevalent in the first trimester. Sometimes miscarriages happen and the mother may not even be aware. Both short-term and long-term grief are issues following pregnancy loss, and this is something to keep in mind as you're working with young couples that have lost a baby. The grief associated with that is every bit as real as if that baby had been born and died, and certainly professional consideration needs to be given to providing assistance, talking with those parents, particularly the women, about any issues that come up. The second trimester is the most rapid period for brain development, and generally is for the mother is a period of contentment, generally speaking. During this trimester is when the mother begins to feel fetal movement. That's referred to as quickening. And in the third trimester, there's some issues about maternal weight gain that can make could create a risk for preterm delivery and higher rates of the need for cesarean sections. Maternal smoking decreases fetal circulation and is associated with low birth weight. Again, it's one of those things that I think doctors used to say, sit down, have a glass of wine, smoke a cigarette. I mean, I'm serious. It's amazing that our generation, the ones before it, were actually produced in some kind of healthy fashion. But even, it's interesting, the text says, even for the males, the spouse, those who smoke outside, deliberately not smoking inside, but who smoke outside, still increase the nicotine level in a non-smoking pregnant woman. Just, boy, I'll tell you, it's interesting, isn't it? Maternal stress can reduce the blood flow and reduce fetal weight gain. So essentially the fetus is, during this trimester, is supposed to gain weight and mature in preparation for delivery. And by 24 weeks, our text says that the fetus is considered to be viable. That depends, I think, upon the hospital and the doctor and other factors, but generally speaking, it's around that period of time when viability is considered to be there. So actually this slide should probably be in the next group, but it's about labor and delivery of the neonate. The descent of the fetus into the mother's pelvis, called lightening, typically occurs earlier for a first-time mother. I think it said that like 2 weeks before delivery or inabouts, but after that, with women who've had children before, generally it occurs right before delivery. There's quite a bit of discussion about the labor and its various stages with intensity and frequency of contractions as the labor progresses. No need to go into that here. If the baby is born breech, which feet or buttocks first, or is transverse, or positioned horizontally in the birth canal, the person delivering the baby will attempt to turn the baby prior to birth, but if it can't be done, may require a cesarean section. Once the baby is born, once the fetus comes out of the mother and enters the world, that fetus then becomes what is called a neonate, and this child undergoes very rapid physical changes, much of which seems to be prompted by that very first breath that the baby takes, and when the text actually says the baby is breathing, but for no real purpose even before delivery. There's all sorts of things that happen once that baby takes the first breath, and the heart begins to function, coordinates with the lungs, and all of those kinds of things. And the infant also has to establish a stable temperature. This is all stuff that was, pretty much handled by the mom when the child was still in utero. And I regret that this is the last thing on this slide. I might have thought about this when I put these things together, but stillbirth is the last mention in this particular lecture. And this is a baby that's born with no signs of life after 28 weeks of gestation. This occurs statistically about 1 in 160 births in the United States. And again, will create a great amount of stress and anguish for parents, and it's something that as social workers involved with families, we need to be aware of that and be ready to provide or coordinate whatever services are necessary to assist the family. Okay, that's it for the first part, and I'll close this for now, and hope you'll join me for the second part real soon. Thank you.